here's what I'd like to talk about. I'd like to talk about this topic of the food we eat in a larger context, basically involving human health, obviously, environmental health. And of course, when we talk about those two really big topics, there are many parts of this. We tend to sort of work in silos and little specific projects, if you will, involving each of those areas. In the case of environmental health, we talk about global warming, we talk about deforestation, topsoil loss, and so forth and so on, even ocean pollution and the like. And we can just sort of create 8 to 10 of these sort of topics, if you will. In the case of human health, we talk about healthcare costs. This is certainly very germane to the problems in the United States. We talk about the overuse of drugs as a means of maintaining health. And of course, the use of drugs, we now know, have side effects. And the United States, just by way of comparison, the United States is #1 in the world in terms of per capita use of drugs. So we're really heavily into drugs. And unfortunately, the system is such that, and when I say the system, the media and so forth, tend not to want to acknowledge its role for nutrition. Drugs, in turn, have side effects. And so we tend to think of each of these problems, whether human health, environmental health, or whatever, we tend to think each one of them has a cause, if you will. When I'm going to suggest, in fact, that they together, environmental and health problems are such a comprehensive collection of problems. It's all related, actually, to the food we eat. When I talk about the food we eat, I'm talking about it in two ways, two main points. Number one, I suggest eating plants, that is vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, and nuts, of course. That's one idea, basically to avoid the animal foods, if you will. And secondly, the second thing to keep in mind is that when we're consuming plant material, it's a good idea to try to consume it as the whole plants, rather than taking out the parts of the plants, nutrients here, nutrients there, and recombining them. It's better to eat the whole plants. Now, we can cook the food, we can chop it up, we can do various and sundry things, but the idea is this. When we take a bite of food, it's a good idea we have all the nutrients there for our body to look at to see which of the nutrients that's in that food might be selected for absorption and transport in the blood and subsequent metabolism. Now, when I talk about these two items, eating just plants, not animals, that brings me back to my own background, which is important to this topic. I was raised on a farm, dairy farm, milking cows, and not thinking about nutrition for sure in those days. That was in the 1950s. Finally, after living a life of consuming meat, milk, and eggs in large measure, I went up to graduate school at Cornell University, then did my doctoral dissertation on sort of doing on a project to increase, if you will, or encourage the increased consumption of animal protein. I talked about it just in protein in those days, but it was animal-based protein. Then after that, I was in an academic program at the Virginia Tech University in the Department of Biochemistry, and I was given an assignment to coordinate a program we had in the Philippines to feed malnourished children. There, we, like others in the nutrition community, thought that the malnourished children problem in the world was primarily related to the fact they weren't getting enough protein. So that fit in with my background, my training, make sure they get enough protein. But I happened to have seen at that time, with fairly loose evidence, that the children getting the most protein, and they were fewer in number, got liver cancer of all things, a serious disease. And then there was a project that came out about that same time in the literature on experimental animals, in this case from India, where they had the idea, the hypothesis, that if protein was fed at a higher level, let's say in experimental animals that are destined to get liver cancer, if they were to feed more protein, and in this case it was animal-based protein, milk protein, they would get less cancer. When in reality, when you got the results, feeding more protein they got more cancer. And I mean, it was a big difference. Animals given their 20% protein, which is considered the regular levels, 20% of energy, all the animals got cancer. In contrast, the animals given the lower levels of protein, none did. I mean, that was a spectacular difference. Obviously, it was exactly the opposite what I expected to see, opposite what the Indian workers thought they too were seeing. I mean, after all, animal protein increase in cancer was kind of a shock to the system, to say the least. So I came back home and organized my laboratory with funding from our government at the time. A study with that was to continue over the next 27 years. Namely, it was initially, I simply wanted to ask the question, is it possible that increased animal protein actually increased cancer? It seemed ridiculous. So we did a study, and what we did it in many, many different ways over the years, but basically the first and main thing I think that really caught my attention was the fact that when animal protein was fed at the higher levels, the cancers grew. When we switched the diet midstream to a lower level of protein, we turned the cancer off. Of course, we could turn it on, turn it off, kind of thing. And that idea that cancer growth could be controlled. I mean, I should say cancer growth initiated by genetic mutations. So genes obviously are the beginning point. But when we sort of adjusted the level of protein throughout the whole process, we could turn the cancer on and off. Now, so that did two things. First off, it basically confirmed this idea that feeding animal protein actually increased cancer as opposed to low levels of animal protein. And incidentally, to jump ahead, it was only animal protein did that, not plant protein. So that being said, it also demonstrated something in a more general nature, namely that we all tend to think, and we did in those days, that cancer starts with genes, and that's true. It starts with genes, a mutated gene. On the one hand, and that pretty much determines whether or not we're going to get cancer. When in reality, what we were seeing, that's not quite the answer. It starts with genes, but in reality, it's the kind of nutrition that we use, the food we consume, that turns on the cancer. So it sort of departed from the general genetic determinism idea of cancer and brought it to the idea that it's the nutrition that we consume that turns the cancer on and off, if you will. Very exciting idea. Then we decided at this point in time, I mean, I'm finally getting a little more convinced that the higher protein diet, animal protein, I should say, not plant protein, the higher animal protein was very dramatic in its effect to be able to turn on cancer. And the next question we tend to ask in research, when you see an odd observation like this, one that's difficult to understand, imagine, what we tend to do is to find out what is the biochemical mechanism for this effect. And so in being in biochemistry, there was lots of options to search for a mechanism. And so we looked for some. And this was a process that occurred over probably 12 to 15 years. I had graduate students, each one of them sort of doing their dissertation on one of these possibilities to find the key mechanism. And so we went through some, as I say, over that period of time. And it seemed like every time we looked for a mechanism, we found one. We found one. I finally got to a point, I couldn't decide which one is the key mechanism. It wasn't possible because they were all turned on at the same time. What made this idea really, though, interesting was that among 10 mechanisms that we had isolated and identified at the time, among 10 mechanisms, 8 of them, when we elevate the activity by the high protein feeding, the cancer was turned on. There were 2 mechanisms that when they're elevated, they were mechanisms that actually protect us from the carcinogenic damage. The high protein in that particular case turned off these good mechanisms. Instead of elevating them, it turned them off. So here we had 10 mechanisms, 10 of them were increased, 2 of them were decreased, and they all result in the same effect. That is, collectively, they actually all increase cancer. That was an observation that really stuck in my mind at the time, and much more so over the years, because it turned out there is no such thing in nutrition as a single mechanism. I would suggest nutrient when it consumes has, now we know, it has multiple mechanisms we might choose. And so we can't really rely on the idea of taking a single mechanism, say if we stop that mechanism by a drug or something of that sort, that we're going to achieve anything. When in reality, that is the drug paradigm, if you will. Somehow we can take drugs and target a mechanism that might cause disease and stop it or adjust it in such a way that to our benefit. What I found was that all these mechanisms tended to work together, in a sort of a symphony-like effect. And that was an idea that I got very excited about. I called it holism, with a W, not just the H. Holism, everything working together, which opened up a vast new arena of thinking about what nutrition really is. Nutrition not about the consumption of individual nutrients, even though we study them that way, fair enough, but it's not about individual nutrients having that much effect. As a matter of fact, when we take a nutrient out of a good food that seems to be involved in the good effect, if we take the nutrient out and put it in a pill, it oftentimes doesn't work the same way. In fact, there's some evidence that we learned at the time, it could have the opposite effect. But let me come back to the protein question just for a moment. We found a total of 10 mechanisms, and as I say, 8 actually increase cancer, and 2 of them, when we're turned off with high protein feeding, that also increased cancer. So it was a really exciting opportunity to see that the whole drug paradigm, or the pharmaceutical paradigm of trying to solve problems in this way that is related to nutrition, it didn't make sense. Nonetheless, that's what our system is. That's what Western medicine is. We tend to rely heavily on the use of individual chemicals, however toxic they may be, however much side effects they may be, and we rely on that, and that is the standard way of thinking about Western medicine. When in reality, when we start thinking about the enormous complexity in the cell, how all these mechanisms work together, that is the essence of the story. That's the one that we have to remember, is that when everything is working together, we cannot really reasonably take one thing at a time and try to solve our problems. Now, with all that said, let me then also suggest to you another sort of display of information that really caught my attention over the years. Namely, it really has to do with what relationship is there between diet and, let's say, a variety of diseases in the context of consuming animal-based protein. Because what we learned in the laboratory, it was focused on animal protein, not plant protein, to cause this effect. Now, I'm going to actually tell you, and because I can't show you here, I'm going to tell you about a number of so-called observation studies done in humans over the years, actually since 1959 to be specific, that they have published in the literature over the years, and I've collected these charts together, they're really quite impressive, to show that as animal protein consumption has increased for these various diseases, from kidney disease to heart disease, to prostate cancer, breast cancer, colon cancer, and uterine cancer. These have all been published, the work of other people. You see a straight line relationship, a linear regression, as we increase the consumption of various and sundry things reflecting animal protein intake, the disease increased in a linear fashion. That regression line, by the way, comes right straight down, and comes basically to the origin, the XY origin, as we call it, which suggests that even in theory, adding any animal protein begins to theoretically increase the risk for these diseases, number one. Number two, it turns out that it affects a variety of diseases, from heart disease to cancer and diabetes and so forth, all having the same display of a regression line coming up from the XY origin. It's really quite fascinating. And of course, if we then stop and think about this in the context of each nutrient in that food, especially animal protein, have a multiple mechanisms, suddenly we're talking about a whole world of effects here. Is really quite fascinating. There were some studies done with respect to consumption of plant-based foods and disease outcome, and there was no relationship. So once again, it was all about animal foods. And I call the animal foods what they did, what these researchers had done from time to time was to consider the relationship of, let's say, skim milk intake versus prostate cancer. And so that led the researchers to focus on the idea that something about skim milk was involved. Others showed a relationship between meat consumption and colon cancer. Some showed a relationship between cholesterol intake and heart disease. And when we do that kind of research, and that's what's been done over the years, we tend to focus on just one item in the food that is responsible for that particular disease outcome. But in reality, in the collection of the charts that I found in this category, every single one of those so-called things, whether it's total fat, meat intake, saturated fat, or cholesterol, whatever, it turned out all of these are indicators of one thing, namely animal protein. So that raises the question, where in the world did we get this idea that animal protein is so important? I mean, there is in our societies and human nature, I guess it is, it's been going on for a long time. We've come to think that protein is so important, and it is. Protein is important, it's essential nutrient. We need protein, of course, but we tend to fixate on the idea that the protein that we need is animal-based. And the reason we do that, in large measure, and I have some slides to show you this, is that the reason we tend to fixate on animal protein as opposed to plant protein is because animal protein is said to be high quality. What does that mean? High quality. High quality means the same thing as in the laboratory, at least the same thing as biological value. So way back about 100 years ago, there were some researchers that were working on this question, determining which of all the proteins have high value, which ones have the high biological value. And it turns out this concept translates in such a way that animal foods, animal proteins are considered to have high value. They differ a little bit in those values, of course, depending on what the measurement we're making. But all the animal proteins tend to be of high quality. They had high value, they're called high quality. Plant proteins did not. And so, and everybody likes quality. So what really happened, and this started in the 1920s and 30s or so, was the idea that we need protein. It needs to be animal-based, and we use animal protein because it's high quality. I mean, that translates subconsciously, I would suggest, almost unconsciously, to the public at large. It has a scientific basis, so it is said, on the one hand. On the other hand, when we think of it in the context of eating food that has protein content, we do that, and then but we don't want to, and this is a historical fact. Over the years, we started realizing that certain kinds of food would increase cancer, would increase heart disease, would increase this and that. We started to look at it, but we always kept looking at some specific nutrient in the food that might be related to it. That would lead to the idea that saturated fat causes cancer. It would lead to the general idea that fat causes cancer or heart disease. Leads to the idea that cholesterol causes cancer. When in reality, those are not the individual things that are operating. They're all reflective, it turns out. They all converge to one idea. It's our worship of protein. It's our worship of protein, animal-based protein that does this. So I became quite interested quite a number of years ago. And where did we get this almost religious fervor for consuming animal-based protein? And so went back, in fact, this was in the 1980s when I spent a year at Oxford University. I was being pretty much attacked by some of my colleagues for even suggesting that animal protein might cause cancer. So I got in the libraries at Oxford and looked up some of the old literature, especially in Europe at the time, going back to the English side, the English language. And so I got back to the 1800s and found that a certain gentleman by the name of Gerhard Mulder, I think he's Dutch, I believe, actually discovered protein. What he was doing a study with dogs, and he was feeding them meat, and he found out, sure enough, that when they didn't have the meat, they would die. So he started chemically searching for the chemical in the meat that might account for that effect. And he found a chemical, isolated it. It turned out that was the first nutrient to be isolated. This was 1839. And so he had to give it a name because he considered it to be so important. He came up with a name. The name was actually coming from the Greek word proteos, Proteios, which means of prime importance. So the discovery of protein, animal protein in this particular case, is that that chemical was baptized with the name protein for the Western language. Protein coming from the word proteos, meaning of prime importance. So it became a question of, why is this here protein of such importance? Well, that brings me back to the comments I made before, that the animal protein is higher quality because it would stimulate the growth rate of animals better than plant protein. They would grow faster. Well, that was a good idea for the farmer, who was raising livestock, or let's say pigs and chickens and so forth. They would grow faster and on animal protein as opposed to plant protein. And in a technical sense, that really has to do with the fact that the animal proteins of the protein being consumed, a higher percentage is retained in the body. That's where the concept of biological value comes from that I spoke about before. So animal proteins, as we consume them, a higher proportion of the protein is retained in the body as opposed to plant proteins. And it really kind of interesting. That was formalized in a report in 1924 from the University of Illinois in the United States, actually, how to go about determining the biological value of these different proteins. In any case, so that's what we've lived with. We still live with that today, unconsciously, that animal protein is so important. Or protein is important. It is important, but we tend to think, too many of us tend to think we have to consume some animal protein to get that, all having to do with, in a laboratory, having to do with a higher proportion of the protein being retained to stimulate growth. Well, it turns out, and this is information been developed in the last 3 or 4 decades, I guess you could say now, the higher the proportion of the protein that's retained in the body, as nitrogen, by the way, but the higher proportion of the protein that's retained, that in turn increases the development of growth hormone. Growth hormone. It only stimulates growth rate, but it increases growth hormone. Now, the growth hormone that was actually discovered in this category was called insulin-like growth factor. That in turn is now known to be an indicator of increased cancer risk in humans. The higher the animal protein consumption, it increases the circulating levels, that's the blood levels, of estrogen. Higher circulating levels of estrogen are associated with higher breast cancer and other effects involving the reproductive system. So higher protein means more estrogen circulating in the blood and higher risk for breast cancer and uterine cancer. Higher animal protein consumption, and this comes originally from experimental animal studies that we did with some colleagues, the higher the consumption of animal proteins, the higher the rate of formation of what we call free radicals, oxygen-free radicals, very reactive chemicals or metabolites, if you will. Those free radicals, in turn, now are known to be associated in many studies with the increased rate of aging, as well as the increased rate of cancer. So again, animal protein has the property of increasing the production of free radicals, as well as more circulating estrogen, more growth hormone. Higher animal protein, this is from our studies, also higher protein consumption increases the rate of mutations that start cancer. And in the process, while it's increasing all those mechanisms I mentioned before, it actually decreases a couple of things that I mentioned, one of which is the so-called natural killer cells. Natural killer cells is the B cells of the, the T cells of the immune system. So the higher animal protein decreases natural killer cells. Natural killer cells are a really important part of our immune system and tends to attack pathogenic organisms and so forth. And a higher animal protein actually decreases DNA repair, which is a repair in the potential mutations that are to occur. High animal protein increases blood cholesterol, which in turn is associated with increased heart disease. That was first noted in 1905 by Russian scientists, believe it or not. High animal protein also increases blood sugar, increases A1C, the kinds of things that are associated with diabetes. So higher animal protein does a lot of things biochemically that should be translating into information that's not good stuff. And it starts out with even a small intake of animal protein. Even small intakes of animal protein will begin to increase the risk for cancer, variety of cancers, increase the risk for heart disease, and increase the risk for diabetes, in addition to chronic kidney disease and a few autoimmune diseases. So now all of a sudden we do know, and we've got really good data on this from the laboratory to show that animal protein is not the right kind of protein by any means. It turns out that the amount of protein that we need that's been recommended for consumption is around maybe 8-10% of total calories. It's a recommendation made by agencies in the United States as well as elsewhere. I'm familiar with the one in this country. It's done by the National Academy of Sciences, but it's been generally recognized for, 75 years now, that we only need about 8 to 10% of total calories as protein. And that amount of protein can be supplied by plants, and it does it very well. And so, in fact, it's ideal because when it's all supplied by plants only, we don't get these other disease outcomes for starters. But unfortunately, most of people in Western societies tend to think protein only comes from animals, for this long history of believing that way. So we consume animal protein to meet our protein needs, if you will, when it's really nonsense. As we increase animal protein intake, we're increasing the risk, as shown in those slides that I mentioned before, in the observational studies. Human disease increases linearly with increases in animal protein consumption, all those mentioned in different ways. So what I'm really talking about here, I'm sorry I can't show you the slides on this, it'd be much easier to understand. The animal protein myth has arisen from the laboratory inappropriately. And because in that process, we tended to forget about the bad things animal protein does. It also, the myth is supported by observational studies in humans. Just because we see as these diseases increase in risk or increase in mortality or incidence, as they increase, we see an increase in some other things like skim milk or like saturated fat, which in fact really reflect an animal protein intake. So I am really excited about the possibility, I've begun to publish on this quite a bit, that finally we now have from the laboratory empirical data organized very carefully to see what really happens with no predisposition, if you will, or hopefully no predisposition of favoring one kind of protein or another. What the science shows unequivocally is that as we increase animal protein intake, animal protein turns out to be, by anybody's definition, toxic. It's that simple. And so I'm really anxious to get that story out there told in the right way. And as I say, I'm publishing some work on that at the present time, we really got to go to the plant-based diet because we do not need to consume animal foods in order to get that protein. That's nonsense. We get all the protein we need from plant-based foods. Now, all of this there translates into some really important policy decisions that I'm familiar with. And again, in this case, mostly in the United States, although it's translated into Europe as well. As I said before, it's been determined by our National Academy of Science, first in 1943, many years ago, every 5 years since. It's been determined that we only need about 10% protein really for good health. That can be supplied by plants. And so there's various other metrics that have been attached to those recommendations over the years. Well, it turns out in one of the most recent editions of those dietary guidelines, we call them, they decided that that the level of protein that we need to consume it could go really much higher, and it was safe. In other words, they established an upper safe level for protein intake, and they set it at 35%. 35% of calories. Mind you, I just said 10% is enough. Now we're living with levels as high as 35% of total calories is said to be okay. There's no problem. Well, that is nonsense, because it turns out that when you superimpose the graphs that I've spoken about before over that range of consumption, as we exceed 10% protein in the form of animal protein or animal foods, as we do that, then we see an increased risk of all these diseases. Now, I should add a little caveat here. The plant food, or the plant protein, if you will, when we're consuming extra protein from plants, it doesn't work that way. We can consume protein in much higher numbers or much higher levels, if you will, if we're eating the plant food, and it doesn't make any difference, because first off, the plant protein does not increase the cancer like animal protein does. It does not increase the blood cholesterol like animal protein does. These are data, these are reports from many years ago, not recognized quite this way. But in any case, the amount of protein that we need is 10%, all supplied by plants. We can let the plant consumption of protein go higher, no problem. We cannot, though, be letting the protein content go higher from animal foods alone. So in 2002, to come back to my point, in the most recent edition of the dietary guidelines, it turns out that they decided 35% is okay. Well, I'm quite familiar with the committees that do that. I've been on those committees myself, been quite active actually in some of the food and health policy issues in Washington and elsewhere. And I knew some of the people on that particular committee. When I saw that 35% figure, which just seems such nonsense, that we could go that high and safely consume all that protein. And I asked him, I said, what are you doing that for? And my two colleagues, two of them who I knew on the committee, said they didn't even know it. Their committee had not concluded that 35% was high, was an okay number. So I looked a little more carefully. That number actually came from not the committee report. It was not justified in the committee report. The number came from the reporting of the report in a so-called news release. And the news release was controlled by Academy authorities at that time. And so I thought it was obviously very clear here there's some shenanigans going on, that somehow at that level where newspapers became aware of what the science supposedly was saying, they were saying that we could consume protein up to 35%. I started to look on more further. It turns out the organizations who were supporting that really wild number was the Dairy Institute, the Dannon Institute. Basically, they're all corporate bodies. And of course, I know quite a bit about that linkage, quite frankly. And so the number that came up with it, the 35% came up, that first off, it was not justified in science as they said it was. That's untrue. And secondly, it was put in as a means of making a news release, and it was all done in the service, in my view, in the service of the organizations who were funding that. Unfortunately, we've had to live with that 35% number now. It gets into government regulations and government recommendations. And it's unfortunately, it's happening in Europe too. I think if one will look at the recommendations of protein, which oftentimes is influenced heavily by the recommendations made in Washington as well, you'll find that upper safe level of protein being 35%, I have to say very, very bluntly and very candidly, It is nonsense. And the only reason that 35% figure was put there in the first place and directed by individuals who were subservient to the industry, the only reason for that was to justify, if you will, justify the consumption of more protein. And where do we get more protein from? Everybody tends to believe it comes from animal food. So we've lived with this problem of protein from 1800s onwards, when it was considered to be of prime importance, and through the years, through the decades. And when somebody came along and showed something that the animal protein did not work like we said it did, maybe there were problems with it, those researchers were basically remanded, discarded, ignored, and their reputations were essentially taken away from them. So we've gained over history this belief system that somehow we have to consume X amount of protein at fairly high levels. It's safe. And lo and behold, we all tend to believe it comes from animals. I would argue that now, based on rigorous science, based on historical evidence that has been accumulated over the years, that we can now unequivocally show that there is no need for protein from animal sources. Now that raises a very major question, I'm sure, for many of the listeners here, especially the vegan movement, vegetarian movement, if you will, for ethical reasons, obviously, are not, at least the vegan movement, are not choosing to eat animal foods for ethical reasons, obviously, animal welfare. But in reality, and I'm not sure that the vegan community is making appropriate arguments along those lines. They're not going into the science as they should. So I get a little trouble with the arguments being made for the vegan initiative based on science. It's just not very convincing. It's not very good. But on the other hand, if we go right to the science itself, reorganize our thoughts, go back in history, think about this carefully, the chief nutrient that actually influences our dietary behavior in the wrong way is actually animal protein. We do not need it, okay? So we should be arriving at a point in time now when we should just abandon the idea that there's any need whatsoever for the animal protein. As I say, just pretty much say it again, we can get all of our protein from plant source foods. I'm going to, I wish I had these charts together for you. There's one more point I want to make, basically, regarding the general dietary recommendations, and it's this. I talk about whole food as you know, I mentioned that before. And I also alluded to the comment, made a comment that we have evidence that when we take nutrients out of whole food, even good nutrients out of whole food, and we put it in pills, and we presume it's going to work the same way, now we have lots of evidence that's not true. That's a very risky thing, and oftentimes it turns out simply to be untrue, and it can actually have the opposite effect of that intended. The first time this was identified, at least in a fairly major way, was in 1981, when I was in the midst of my research career at the time. There was a study done by a group out of Chicago on smokers. And what they were doing was they were showing that people who smoked the most, say 30 years or more, they had the highest risk for lung cancer. Of course, that was the way the studies were going. More smoking, more lung cancer, very clear. But then they also, in that study, did something else amongst these heavy smokers. What they did, they took blood samples. They measured their food intake. And what they found was that among the heavy smokers, these are smokers consuming 30 years or more, among these smokers with a very high risk of getting lung cancer, for those who consume the most beta carotene being the provitamin A in food, people consuming the most beta carotene, even though they were smoking a lot, their risk of getting lung cancer almost went down to zero, almost went down to background, amazingly. And they divided these consumption levels into, we call them quartiles, and they really got almost a perfect dose-response relationship. And that is, if I can summarize this quickly, among heavy smokers, destined to get a lot of lung cancer, those who consume more beta carotene, obviously comes from plants, okay? those consuming more beta carotene and really at much higher levels, their risk of getting lung cancer was almost down to baseline. A remarkable effect of nutrition on a really serious disease outcome, lung cancer, basically. And I was at the time when I happened to mention that, and my comments got into the press a bit, and I got scolded by some folks who were trying to, at the time, and rightfully so, they were trying to advocate, stop smoking campaigns. And I understood that, because if you all of a sudden started saying that, hey, you can keep on smoking as long as you eat your vegetables, that wasn't a very good message. So I certainly went along with that idea, because smoking is not good for a variety of reasons. But nonetheless, the data were there to show that the beta carotene, an antioxidant in plants, colored plants, I should say, have this property of being able to reduce cancer risk and heart disease risk and a few other things. And so they then organized a study, and when I say they, in this particular case, it was American scientists and Norwegian scientists who undertook a study of heavy smokers. There was about 29,000 smokers in that case. What they did, they gave 1/2 beta carotene supplements. So it looked like this beta carotene looks pretty good. So they gave 1/2 beta carotene supplements, and the other half they just gave them a placebo. And it turned out among the smokers that consumed the beta carotene from the food, sure enough, their risk of getting lung cancer went down as they consumed more beta carotene. In contrast, among the smokers who consume beta carotene in the form of supplements, those consuming the beta carotene supplements, it did not decrease the lung cancer risk. It actually increased lung cancer risk and was statistically significant. Exactly the opposite effect. That study just showed that when you take a nutrient out, like in this case, beta carotene, you take it out of the food and put it into a pill, it does not work in the same way. In fact, it produced the opposite effect. Now, there's been a number of those studies showing that kind of thing over the years. When nutrients are taken out and put in a pill, that's not the same as consuming them in the form of whole food. That's really what really got me on the bandwagon eventually, and talking about the idea from that point of view and some other kinds of observations, that eating the whole food to get the nutrition is the way to go. We can't just sort of take them out and put them in pills and so forth and so on. In any case, this idea now, so my thoughts about diet and disease is such that I don't want to focus on one nutrient at a time. I don't want to focus on one mechanism, because that might suggest a certain kind of medication to take. And I don't want to actually focus on one disease at a time, because it turns out nutrition in the form of whole food, plant-based diets, it turns out that collective effect is really amazing. It has a very broad effect on a variety of diseases, from cancer to cardiovascular diseases, multiple sclerosis, kidney stones, osteoporosis, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So nutrition has this, when it's done the right way, all plants, whole food, it has this amazing effect. And that can actually begin to be seen in matters of days, 24 hours or so. And I'm referring in this case to people, let's say, with heart disease. If you put them on a plant-based diet, for example, their risk of disease actually reverses. And you can see cholesterol drop within 24 hours, really precipitously. So the nutritional effect is very significant. The same is true, incidentally, for diabetes. Take diabetics and put them on this kind of diet, and they're, let's say, on the metformin or some other insulin-contributing drug. If you put diabetics, type 2 diabetics, on this kind of diet, their blood sugar goes down so rapidly because of the diet. It goes down so rapidly because of the diet. If they're not taken off their medications, they can actually go into hypoglycemic shock. So the whole food plant-based diet has such a remarkable effect. It's broad, variety of diseases, infinite numbers of mechanisms working together, if you will. And then at the same time, it can actually reverse disease in many cases. There's more work to be done on that. As we go forward, I really feel confident, and I hear it all the time, that more and more people with various systemic chronic disease, if they change their diet and do it right now and do it the whole way, they can see effects very quickly. Now, the question arises, a lot of people have tried that. We're doing some of these kind of studies. I have colleagues doing this kind of studies in this country. They take people with problems, put them on the diet for 10 days. They see it, they get convinced, they get excited about it. But in reality, they don't stay with it all that much, which is kind of troubling. After people see the benefits they get, they learn something about the science and they want to do it, they can't quite do it because they're used to their old habits. Here's a point to keep in mind. For those who wish to do this, I would suggest that the best thing to keep in mind, if they're really convinced they want to do it and they want to stay with it, to keep in mind that if they stay with it rigorously for, let's say, a month, in some cases, maybe 2 months, they will see their preferences for taste change. They suddenly, after a month or 2 or 3, a lot of people before that, but after that period of time, almost everyone will all of a sudden discover that they love salads. They can almost live on salads alone. They just love the plants. And they tend not to go back because now they're feeling the benefits, the health benefits, and on the one hand, and then on the other, low cost of health care, for example, feeling good about themselves, they're used to the food and they stay with it. One final comment, I see my time is about running out here. When I talk about the breadth of effect of these various diseases, I'm talking about cancers, heart disease, all that sort of thing. There's one group of diseases that are not considered in this retrospective examination of the literature very much. It has to do with the viral diseases, And of course, now we're living in a pandemic era with the coronavirus. And it so happens in a major study we did in China that many of you may know about, back in the 1980s, we measured the effect of diet on a variety of different diseases and got some really impressive data from that human study. We actually had a couple of viral diseases in there too. So I went back and looked at the viral disease, see what we could find. And one of the virus diseases that we worked with was one that actually kills about 800,000 people a year worldwide, believe it or not, very serious virus. It's hepatitis B virus and liver cancer. Okay, so we had evidence from our China study that in the geographic regions where liver cancer was very high, those folks, and in this particular study, it was about 9,000 people in our study, those folks that in a region where liver cancer was high, the ones who got the liver cancer were the ones consuming animal food, and we measure it in different ways. Even a small level of consumption of animal foods increased the risk of getting liver cancer, and they died. So people who died of liver cancer, of that virus, were consuming animal protein, animal-based foods. And as I say, at a level only about 10% of what we do, for example, in the United States, very low levels of protein, but it was enough to really cause that problem. In contrast, the people consuming more plant foods in that study at the time, lo and behold, they were the ones who had antibodies circulating, and they did not get the liver cancer. The people consuming the animal food, in contrast, did not form the antibodies. They maintained this so-called antigen, that's the active virus. So, okay, let me summarize quickly. People consuming animal food do not form antibodies, okay? And they're the ones that get the liver cancer. People consuming more plant foods, they were the ones who do not get the liver cancer because they're forming antibodies, for starters. There's more to this story than just what I reported to you, but that was highly significant. For those of you familiar with statistics, it was a number of factors all pointed to the same endpoint. I only used the correlates that were significant at the probability level of 0.001. So I found this really quite spectacular myself. I published these data at the early part of this year, just to finish that little story off. I submitted to a major journal that published in, 50 years ago, in major story. I mean, I'll be specific. That's in Nature, really good journal, excellent reputation over the years. And they got a collection of sub-journals, if you will, in the Nature collection in the world, in that world. I sent it in for a review. I was excited about reporting this study in the context of the COVID story, the coronavirus story. I sent it in, they wouldn't even review it. The first time in my life, I got about 350 publications. It's the first time I've ever had that experience. The ones who looked at that paper, because I suggested there's a possibility here, there's a lesson here maybe for coronavirus. You know, people who eat the right way, eat the kind of the diet that actually reverses heart disease, controls the kind of diet that reverses cancer, controls cancer and so forth. The same thing is working for viral disease, at least a viral disease here. So I didn't think it was going out too far on a limb to suggest maybe this will work too on the coronavirus. Lo and behold, I published eventually I couldn't publish in the top journals that wouldn't take it at the time. They didn't even want to review it. I published it in EC Nutrition. That's the European Commission Nutrition. And came out last February. Since that time, 2 other research groups have also published now studies. And these studies are somewhat weak in some sense because they're not able to do the random, controlled trials quite this way. But it shows also highly significant results for those who actually suffer the infection from the coronavirus. Those who are eating this kind of food. So, and from the data we have, it suggests that they are much more likely to form antibodies and certainly decrease the severity of disease without a doubt. So I think the story now on the plant-based diet, whole food plant-based diet, is becoming ever more exciting. It reverses and controls and keeps under control the serious disease that we've lived with. At the same time, they seem now to work on viral diseases too. I'm putting that out there as a hypothesis. I know it's a very sensitive area at the moment to say anything about it. I'm aware of that. And one has to be careful. I want to be very careful about this and say, these are what the data show. And so as far as whether, and so it creates immunity. The whole food plant-based diet creates a standard immunity that is pretty constant and stable over time, more or less, is one of the main ways to get, I would call, innate immunity. And what I find really, really troubling about the conversation that's going on now in the world, as a matter of fact, is that we keep talking about all the time, the only way to get immunity is through the use of vaccines. Fair enough. I mean, there's good data to show there's some of that kind of effect. But we should not be doing that at the expense of never, ever talking about nutrition, because nutrition is so powerful. It's so powerful that, as was already been illustrated with this breadth of effect across a number of different diseases, and now with specific information on some of the coronavirus as well, we should not be in the business of denying any comment on nutrition because we just don't like it. Okay, I think my time has run out. I've just watched the time here. There's one more thing I would like to leave with you.
Sorry, Dr. Campbell, I just want to add that we have been able to extend a little more time since we got postponed, delayed due to the technical issues. So you can take your time a bit more if you feel like 10 minutes or so, perhaps. That's great. Thank you.
Well, let me turn to then the first idea was put in front of you, namely having to do with the fact that we've got all these environmental issues. We've got issues concerning human health that we can consider in various to some ways. And I'm going to suggest that, as I did in the beginning, that one cause, eat the right food. If we all just simply ate the right food, and I'm also suggesting at the same time, my message, it's first off to acknowledge the enormous complexity, the biological complexity of the system. That's fair enough. But we know it's very, very complex, and there's millions of different ways we can consider about these relationships. But really interestingly, when we look at food and nutrition that's expressed by the food, when we look at it that way, we see this sort of comprehensive effect, all the nutrients really working together in symphony to create a vast, a very breadth of effect for different kind of diseases that I'm going to suggest the basic, it should be included the viral diseases as well. And so to me, it's we need it for the sake of the planet. We need it for the sake of, in all kinds of environmental problems. We need it for the sake of just maintaining health. We need it for all ages, by the way, from young to old. And we can do it. All we need to do is to get it out of our heads that we have to eat the other kind of food in order to get that protein, which is unfortunately has been nonsense for over a century. It's time that we now have data to basically put that right. And I'm going to suggest that one of the ways to do this is, it's important for the public at large, is make a recommendation. Don't focus on individual nutrients. People talk about we got to decrease saturated fat. That's nonsense. Saturated fat chemically is not very reactive. It's polyunsaturated fats are reactive when they're taken out of the context of the whole food. When we use added oil, for example, that's mostly the kind of oil that is, we call it pro-inflammatory, omega-6, for those of you familiar with that term. That kind of oil actually is not good. It's good in the plant. Leave it in the plant. Eat the whole plant. But we take it out and put it in a bottle. It doesn't quite work that way. So anyhow, back to the whole food thing. Avoid, and we just eat plants. They try to eat them whole. So my message, I think, is simple. Two things. Just people, all they need to know, just eat plants. End of story. If you're into science and you want to know a little more about it, it's complex, but you'll find as you get in there, you'll find that the science really supports this when it's imbued from a holistic perspective. Simple idea. Eat plants, try to make them old. That's one thing. The second thing, and I think this is, again, a sort of a game changer in a many way to realize this. It's an old idea, but it's a game changer for the modern day. Namely, food, to produce this kind of food, plant-based foods, vegetables, fruits, it's sustainable. It is sustainable for maintaining the integrity of the environment, for maintaining the integrity of the soil. It's a means by which we don't have to go through the deforestation. We don't have to pollute the oceans and pollute our waters and so forth, our air. If we just grow plants and find ways to do that, and there are ways, obviously. We did it for a very long time during our evolution. So if we just eat the plants, it's simple, number one. Number two, it's sustainable. It's sustainable, a lot less costly. And in fact, we avoid the very expensive diseases that we get. So I'm going to say it's cost effective in terms of health care. It's cost effective in terms of health care. So here's the message: simple, sustainable, cost effective. What better? I mean, this message is so simple, and we should not be getting so caught up in all the details of all the complexities. The details are endless. And the only reason we do get caught up in the details, quite frankly, to be honest about it, is because if we can fish out one nutrient or talk about one mechanism or one drug to treat something, well, you know why we do that? It makes money. That's the core of business. That's why it's happening. We're following the route of actually this idea. We're actually turning to ways to make money instead of ways to make health. And I'm talking about health for us as people, to our benefit, as well as health for our environment and the entire planetary system. So that's my story. I think it's one can talk about this. It's easy to talk about this for a year without stopping. I mean, there's enough complexity in all of this, but it gets very, very confusing for most folks. And I say that the message is really, really very simple. And I might just leave you with one additional thought. I have not used the word vegan. I know that's a great interest in this community, vegan or vegetarian. When I got involved in this, I was getting information that was very exciting for myself, at least. I was on the National Policy Committee at the time. It was in the late 1970s. And my colleagues on that committee were all cancer researchers, or carcinogenicists, if you will. I was the only one on the committee determining which kind of research money should be spent and how much and that sort of thing. My colleagues they didn't have any training in nutrition, but yet we were getting some applications in, a few handful of people wanted to start looking at nutrition. So they asked me to kind of give them a little lecture presentation, if you will, kind of bring them up to date on some nutritional ideas. And I didn't particularly want to use the vegetarian word because vegetarian is no, as acceptable as that is, I mean, great motivation, that's not the issue. It was not very popular within the scientific community. It was not considered to be very, very scientific, if you will. And there's some reasons to go along with that same idea. But in any case, I wanted to come up with a new term somehow. And the best I could, it would go to last minute kind of thing. I'm not sure it was all that great, but I thought, well, let's call it plant-based. Then 3 or 4 years later, I was involved in being asked to review some statements on nutrient supplements that brought to my attention the word whole. So I like the word whole plant-based. It's you know, it gives us the opportunity to, you know, practice animal welfare, if you will, species loss. It gives, we just don't need to consume the animals that we're consuming now. That's the biggest thing of all. There's no need to raise in the billions and billions of animals for our own food when that kind of food actually causes us harm. It causes us harm. And unfortunately, we got caught in this paradigm. We go along with eating that kind of food, we get sick. So we have more customers now for disease treatment. And so the pharmaceutical companies are stepping up to the plate. Oh, we got the medicines. So on the one hand, we eat the wrong food because of all this nonsense information that we've lived with. We get sick, but we can become customers for the use of medications. So you can see it. There are two huge industries that, I don't mean to say they're working together. They don't really work together. It just turns out that their common interests are such to leave people in a confusing state of affairs, eat the wrong food, get sick, all with the thought that somehow we can get well by using drugs. We got to change that entire paradigm. It's wrong. And we've got to change it immediately or as fast as we possibly can, because the consequences for that are serious. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Campbell. And please, all of you, you might turn off your microphones for a minute. I give a small applause so we can hear it as it sounds like if it was live. It sounds like you're here physically. And, thank you again for this brilliant speech, Professor Campbell. And yeah, it's wonderful to see your enthusiasm and your knowledge about this topic, meaning that we could survive without the PowerPoint presentation, which we will try to get afterwards and then combine it maybe with the recording for those who would like that. But thank you so much. And I also just want to inform people that we've agreed with Dr. Barnard to postpone his speech with 10 minutes. So I don't know if you can hang out on for 15 minutes more, Colin, is that possible?
Yeah, sure.
Sure, great. So we have quite a few questions, and I picked up a few of them. So I'll try to take them in an order. There's one person here who is asking about. So how about, that's Thomas who's asking, what about fish and shellfish? Is that as bad an animal protein as meat, or is there somehow a difference in how bad it is?
When I first encountered this kind of question some years ago, I was inclined to think the fish was probably a little better. But on the one hand, so I was inclined to say, okay, we might make some exception there for that, and also for yogurt. That's the other food too, the fermented dairy. But in reality, as time has passed, no, the fish protein does about the same thing as mammalian protein, land animal protein, in terms of its effect on cholesterol and so forth. So there's no point of eating fish, to be honest about it. And we have another problem with fish too, and that is that they are contaminated, as we now know, or quite severely in many cases with, you know, the pesticides and herbicides and stuff like that to get into the water. So, you know, I mean, if somebody wants to insist on having an exception, okay, there's the fish from the deep waters, but I don't really go along with that.
Great. And then we have a question on supplements. Animated Lauritsen is asking, is supplements always a bad thing, like taking nutrients out of whole food? And of course, we have a few people also asking about, B12, like you could even add iodine, which is added here to the salt, for example.
Right, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's some of that. We have some evidence that, it's okay, and maybe it's good. B12, I think, is one major exception to all the others. And taking B12 on a reasonable basis routinely is not a bad idea, because the vegetables we're now consuming are so purified of their, the soil contamination, that sort of thing, where you can find B12. So we tend to be lacking in B12 if we're just buying the usual food in stores and that sort of thing. So that's okay. Iodine, yes, it has a long history, as you know, for protection against goiter for certain areas of the world away from the oceans, and that sort of thing. So yeah, it's those two supplements. The reason why I don't have any reason to sort of question them seriously, but all the other nutrients, I'm sorry to say, one of the things that the nutrient problem, really the greatest problem with nutrient supplementation or vitamin supplementation, people tend to take that instead of changing their diet. They come to believe that it's a good idea. That's where they're going to get their nutrition. That's not a good idea. That's just simply not a good idea. It's not to say that taking some supplements now and again, is going to make a big difference. And then in turn, now we see some evidence that taking nutrients in that sort of form, there's a risk that may accompany with some of those nutrient unexpected, problems.
Yes,
I like to stick with whole food myself.
Yep. Thank you, Dr. Campbell. Then we have a question on the protein needs for the elderly. What are your thoughts on that? There are some recommendations. It's Katrina who's asking, and she's saying, thank you for an interesting talk, Dr. Campbell. So the protein recommendation for elderly is 65 plus is quite high here in Denmark, but probably also in other countries. It may be hard to fulfill sometimes on a plant-based diet with such high protein recommendations. So what do you think? Is that protein recommendation for elderly too high?
Yeah, I'm quite familiar with that recommendation. It's emerged during the last maybe 15, 20 years or so. Some evidence to support that a bit. I think is a little bit shallow, to be honest about it. But my problem with it tends to suggest that as we get older, we ought to still be using meat, milk, and eggs. More of that to help us out. Actually, we can take older people and put them on a plant-based diet and get the same benefits to a large extent as younger people. So I don't quite understand that the idea was consuming protein in order to protect against muscle loss. That was one of the big things, the sarcopenia that we call it. And maybe there's a little bit of evidence for that. I'm 87 myself. I don't see the point of taking that. I'm always open to new ideas in science. But I don't see any convincing evidence in my way of looking at things to avoid you doing the whole food plant-based diet for older people. It just doesn't make sense to me. So again, that's my interpretation. Some others may want to differ, and they will. But quite frankly, I think staying with the whole food plant-based diet during the entire lifetime is good.
Thank you. Then we have a question and a comment from Mai Hessel. She's saying congratulations to us and thank you to the always inspiring Professor Campbell. No, sorry, I was actually moving into a question I had received. Sorry about that. I'll leave that for later. My confusion here from my side. Instead, I'll move into a question here. Someone is asking, what about iron? Can we really get enough fruit plants? Christina is asking.
Yes, we can. I had a chance to look at that in some depth. We did a study in China that I did not talk about here. It was a huge study across the country that many of you may know about. We actually measured iron status in 5 different ways in China. 5 different ways, from hemoglobin to your blood cell count and so forth. And in those 5 different ways, we found no evidence of iron deficiency among the people consuming a plant-based diet. Now, that doesn't mean to say that under some circumstances we may have that, certain individuals may have the problem. But once again, I mean, it was kind of a surprise to me because I was inclined to believe that, iron supplementation, that's what we're taught. And that's what we've lived with for quite a long time, especially for women, I think, probably. But in reality, we didn't see that evidence. And I think, a lot of the things we become, if we are using the right kind of food from early life, then these kind of problems tend not to emerge. Sometimes the problems we see emerge is because we're consuming the wrong food for a long time. So we want to patch them up with a supplement here and there. Whereas we do the thing right in the first place and do it for a long period of time, our body accommodates to the good food in a good way. And at that particular point in time, we don't need these little patchwork solutions.
Thank you. Then we do have a question here about Tobias, I think, who's asking. He was diagnosed with IBS in 2017 and had a rough bloated stomach ever since. He's been living plant-based for almost 2 years, but he still experiences some bloating. Do you have any recommendations as to what could be implemented in the diet? Is that within your area? And thanks.
I can rely on what my colleagues say in that case, listen to them. Usually the plant-based diet really gives very good activity as far as our intestinal tract is concerned. There is an issue there that might account for some of that, and it has to do with allergies, that may arise for certain individuals. And that's a real thing, it's for sure. But when somebody has a problem of that sort, and again, I'm reflecting mostly from my colleagues and how to go about doing this, it might be a good idea to really focus on, is there a certain kind of grain, usually, maybe a legume, and just avoid it, do a little test of that kind. And if they find something that can alleviate the problem, well, then avoid that food. But yeah, irritable bowel syndrome is kind of a complex issue physiologically. And so people find ways to manage it medically in some cases, but I also have some colleagues on the plant-based side who maintain that it takes longer to resolve the problem, but they generally are able to resolve the problem. But who am I? I can't vouch for what one individual may have and have some difficulty.
Then, one more question here. Has there ever been any study to show if there's an upper limit to how much fruit and vegetables you can eat and still experience growing health benefits, like just fruit and vegetables? If you add more and more and more and more, there's at some point where you don't get additional benefits from eating even more.
Well, I don't know exactly what the nature of the question is, what was the interest, but the 100% plant-based or whole food plant-based really gives, in theory, at least 100% of the benefits. That still leaves some people occasionally still having problems, maybe leftover problems from the past. I don't think that, zero calorie, we limit our food intake by the calorie requirements, as we know. That's sort of the zero-sum game kind of thing. And so as we, consume less and less animal food, we'll make it up for all the plant foods and leave it at that, 100% plant foods. Some people, you can see a lot of benefit, maybe going 90% of the way or 95% of the way. But the problem I have with that approach, even though that in science may be true, or the clinic may be true, the problem with that I have is that why do we want to tease ourselves with the old food that, we should be giving up? Because it makes it ever more difficult, to really go the whole way. So I just partly from a personal, practical point of view, going the whole way and staying there allows us to become accommodated. It's pretty simple.
So thank you so much for your replies to all these questions. So I would now move a bit into, since you've been working a lot, as you said, you've been sitting on national policy committees, etc., and the whole sphere of politics and industry influence and dietary guidelines, and you have a lot of experience in that. And I know you also have a lot of enthusiasm for that topic, because there are a lot of things going on there, power struggles on how to define what is right and what is wrong and what is true and what is false. But I think maybe most relevant for the current situation is, like as you did talk a bit about the current pandemic and the situation, like to what extent are you able to somehow get through to the media or policy advisors in the US on the role of nutrition in the current pandemic, for example? Because we've been trying to push the topic here, and it's really hard. We're having newspapers who are even saying we don't want to write about links between plant-based diets and COVID-19. And it's really weird. They're really feeling somehow scared of doing something that goes against the mainstream consensus currently here. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, that is the question of the day, without a doubt. I've had some of the similar kinds of things. I mentioned the one trying to get a paper published. It's been infecting the scientific community and the medical community as well. It seems like we all have to act like sheep. We can't stray from the flock. You can't, to me, it's a matter of free speech. And I'm very sensitive to that issue, because in science, we're entitled and we're held responsible for speaking the truth. And I don't see how we can do it any other way. And so if we have some exceptions to the run-of-the-mill kind of information that's out there now, we have a right to speak. We have a responsibility to speak. But quite frankly, it's being blocked. It's being blocked. And what I'm going to be very candid. In this country, our media basically owe their existence in large measure to the advertisers, and a major portion of the advertisement dollars they get is from the pharmaceutical companies, period. And so the media, in turn, cannot speak. They cannot speak freely. One of the, probably the most famous person in our country, I'm not going to say his name on there, but I know him. He wrote a very positive commentary on their website. He's one of the major news media outlets about the work we did. But when it came down to talk about it, he could not. In fact, he wanted to say, when he was put under pressure, that somehow I'm a conspiracy theorist, which is really, really annoying, to say the least. And so I think we all have to begin to speak up on that question, whether it's here or Europe or wherever. We cannot, to me, freedom of speech is exactly what the word says. And so, it's almost, in some ways, it's almost more important than focusing on what to eat. It's at that level. And I don't know what else to do except to shout out, exactly what we believe. And with data, that's important. We can't just go around making wild claims without data. But I think the key to all of this is basically making sure we got the data to back it up. And I think we've got some, to me, at least, we've got some data right out of my own research group, for example, that convinces me that nutrition, in this case, against this virus, is also very powerful, the same as it is against other diseases as well. But everybody wants to sell stuff. They want to sell vaccines. That's a big business, let's face it. And so they don't want to hear this idea about, nutrition all working in its marvelous ways and so forth and so on. I'm getting some opportunity to voice my opinion on that. We have in this country one very serious problem I must mention. Even my saying that's what I'm about to say, I'll probably get in trouble. But Bobby Kennedy, who ran for president, was assassinated back in the 1960s. He had several children, one of whom, the oldest, I think his name was Bobby Kennedy Jr. He went off and became an attorney of considerable note. He's taken on really major cases in our country. He's one of the most effective attorneys there are in this area. He's now 67 years of age. He just wrote a book He just wrote a book seriously questioning the whole paradigm within which we live. And his book, when it came out, was #1 on the Amazon list. It was #1 in the New York Times book list. It was #1 on the Wall Street Journal list. It was #1 on USA Today. I don't think I've ever heard of a book being like that. Do you realize that the media have not once mentioned his name? This Bobby Kennedy, from the famous Kennedy family, really enormous fame and great work over the years. I mean, I'm sure but it's so documented. It's so heavily documented. He's an attorney on top of it. He knows the risk of making false claims, but now he's being accused of being a conspiracy theorist. I don't get it. I guess I should get it. He's speaking out against the system that now we're living with. And it's just the way it is.
Yeah, but thank you so much for sharing this also, Professor Campbell. Now time is running up. I think we have Dr. Barnard waiting somewhere, has probably logged on as well. I just want to say thank you for sharing this. And for those of you who might not be familiar with it, of course, we hope that some of your research from your research group on the possible COVID-19 link, that will come out eventually. We do know of at least 3 different studies so far, at least to my knowledge, one from Europe, one from the US, and one from India, who do confirm a strong link to reduced risks of hospitalization. But it would be great to know about your work when that is from your colleagues. We would look forward to know about that, Professor Campbell. But please give a big applause once again to Professor Campbell, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our anniversary webinar, Professor Campbell, and thank you for your important work for humanity. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, and now I hope Louisa is Dr. Barnard online. Oops, we have someone we have to mute. Yeah, is
Yes.
Dr. Barnard with us?
Yes, he is.
Okay, great. I'll just, oh, there you are. Hello, good evening, and sorry for the delay, and thank you for being with us. I'll just give a brief intro. So once again, yeah, and I want to apologize to everyone that we are skipping the break because we got a bit delayed due to some technical issues. So hopefully you'll somehow take a break having the voice on, the sound on in the background, or maybe you did it during the Q&A. So again, I just want to introduce to Dr. Barnard again. So this is it's our 125 years birthday in 2 days from now, and we were founded by doctors back in 1896. So health and nutrition has been with us from the very beginning of our organization, although we do also work, of course, with sustainability and animal ethics, being the Vegetarian Society of Denmark. But health has been there from the very beginning. So we are so happy to celebrate our 125 years with these 2 very distinguished speakers from across the Atlantic. And yeah, wow, we just had Professor Campbell and now you, Dr. Barnard. That's really amazing. I'm excited also to hear what you have to tell us. Just a brief introduction for everyone, although I'm sure you know it since you read what you're going to hear about today. But Neal Barnard is an adjunct professor in medicine at George Washington University of Medicine, and he's also founder of the Physicians Committee of Responsible Medicine, PCRM. Dr. Barnard has been leading many research studies about the importance of the diet, including particularly also intervention studies on diabetes, on weight and obesity and chronic pain, and also, yeah, especially diabetes studies, which has been really groundbreaking studies. And he's also generally been able to influence and inspire the whole medical community in the US to see the potential in the plant-based diets. And he's an author of more than 100 scientific published studies. So everyone, please, I'll give you the floor now, Dr. Barnard. Thank you so much for being with us, and thank you for your patience and flexibility. Welcome.
Great. Well, first of all, congratulations on this wonderful anniversary. It's a testimonial to the wonderful work that you've been doing, and I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to spend a little time with you now. A quick question before I get started. Can you tell me the duration of my presentation? Because I want to make sure that my enthusiasm doesn't carry me too far beyond the time frame that you've allotted.
Yeah, so we've allotted around 45 or up to 50 minutes if need be.
Right.
And it's not that I have all the time I need, but we have, since we already delayed, but you should take the time. We told in advance 45 to 50 minutes. I hope that will be suitable for you. And then we have a Q&A time afterwards also.
That will be perfectly fine. And if anybody wants to take a break after Colin's presentation, I promise I won't say anything important for the next 10 minutes. May I go ahead and share my screen?
Please do so.
Thank you.
Yeah, we'll just check if it works, because Zoom sometimes is teasing us a bit, but if it works well, then it should be fine. Otherwise, we'll have it. Yeah, it looks well.
Very good.
Great.
All right. Well, if it's all right, I would like to present a little bit about our work and what inspired it. Does that sound okay? Very good.
Yeah.
All
Excellent.
right. I have to say, I was inspired by the work of Dr. Dean Ornish, who, as you all know, published really a groundbreaking study in 1990. And he wanted to not just prevent heart attacks or slow down the progression of heart attacks. He wanted to be a little bit bolder and think, can we actually reverse this? In other words, that ugly looking artery at the bottom, could that start to clean out and look more like that healthy artery at the top? And what he did was also remarkable for how low tech it was. No medications, no surgical procedures. It was a vegetarian diet. Okay, obviously, no animal fat, no cholesterol. A half-hour walk every day. Try to manage stress, which is why he didn't do the study here in Washington, D.C., where I am. And avoid tobacco. That was the whole program. But the results were remarkable. Cholesterol dropped 24%. LDL cholesterol, bad cholesterol, dropped 37%. The average person lost 10 kilograms over the first year. That's all great. But what made medical history was the results of angiograms that were conducted after 12 months and compared to those done at the beginning. And they showed that the arteries were actually opening up enough that you could see a measurable difference in 82% of participants. No medications, no drugs, no surgery, nothing. Just what I might say is getting out of the body's way. Now that might sound like a funny thing to say, but you know, if you cut your hand, you don't think about it. That cut will heal. The bandage doesn't heal it. The bandage just protects it. Inside the skin cells is the DNA program for healing your skin. It's not perfect, it leaves a scar, but it does heal. If you break your leg, the cast doesn't heal you. Your body has a healing program, if I can put it that way, in your DNA that allows that healing to occur. Not perfect, but it's there. And what Dr. Ornish did not say, but led us to believe, was that healing was not limited to our skin and to our bones, that maybe healing could occur inside our arteries and other parts of our body. And so we started to want to sort this out and see, could this really be true? You might have seen this picture before. This is an angiogram that was given to me by Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn. And this is an angiogram of the distal left anterior descending artery of another surgeon. That's a diseased-looking artery. That's a crinkly, narrowed coronary artery. Now, this surgeon had serious heart problems, but he couldn't have statins, and he couldn't undergo stenting. The disease process was too advanced. So he had no choice. He went on a low-fat vegan diet. That was it. Let me show you what happened. Now, if the little photo strip is in the way on the right-hand side here, you might drag that out of the way or minimize it, because I want you to see this. Yeah, it looks like the arteries do in fact heal. So my team has been very inspired by this, and we started to try to understand why this is. And it's because animal products have cholesterol, that's the middle column. They've got saturated fat, that's the right column, but plant products don't. They don't have cholesterol at all. They have very little in the way of saturated fat. So when we put the right fuel in the body, things start to get a whole lot better. My team decided to say, okay, what if I don't have heart disease? What if I just want to lose weight? We brought in 64 women. They were all overweight. Half of them went on a low-fat vegan diet. The other half went on a conventional diet. It was designed by the National Cholesterol Education Program. And that conventional diet meant take the skin off your chicken. Don't eat so much red meat. Reduce fat. What people think of as a healthy diet. Well, we didn't ask people to exercise, and it was a 14-week study. And what we suggested was eat fruits and grains and legumes and vegetables. This is the power plate that we devised to show what a healthy diet could consist of. And when our participants came in, they were horrified to discover that they could eat all kinds of indulgent foods like pancakes and oatmeal porridge and chili and things like this. They could even eat pasta as long as it didn't have the meat sauce or cheese sauce, but maybe tomato sauce or artichoke hearts or mushrooms. And some of them even discovered that within a low-fat vegan diet, they might even have some candy. We weren't suggesting it, but the only rules were no animal products and keep oils low. And what we found was their carbohydrate intake rose compared to the control group. Their fat intake fell surprisingly, dramatically, really. And when we looked at their body weight, the average person lost almost 13 pounds in 14 weeks, compared to about 8 pounds in the control group. What really matters, though, is not the fact that they lost weight without counting calories, without limiting carbohydrates, without exercising, just making a qualitative shift. What was more important was the long-term findings. The control group lost weight and put it back on. The vegan group lost weight and kept it off for the 2 years of post-study observation. Okay, why? How is it that I'm losing weight eating spaghetti? Well, the first reason is if you're eating plant foods, vegetables and fruits and beans and whole grains have fiber, which has effectively no calories. But also if you're switching from fatty foods to carbohydrate-rich foods, you're switching from foods that have 9 calories per gram, that's fat, to 4 calories per gram, that's carbohydrate. It doesn't matter what kind of carbohydrate it is, from potatoes, from bread, from rice, from pure sugar. It still only has 4 calories per gram. Now, they vary in quality. You might say, I think I can do without candy. I want to make the healthiest choices. Of course you do, and that's good. But what we found is that a plant-based diet wasn't the ultimate end. It was really the beginning, that when people began this healthy diet, they had power over their weight that they hadn't had before. The other piece of this, though, is not just the intake. It's also the output. Your body burns calories faster. Everyone in our study had what we call indirect calorimetry. We measured their after-meal calorie burn, sometimes called the thermic effect of food. You're absorbing nutrients and you're burning them up. Some of them you're storing. That takes calories. So after pretty much every meal you eat, your calorie burn increases. But after having been on a plant-based diet, that increased burn is higher than it would otherwise have been. Not a lot, maybe 15%. It's a small edge, but it's there. We proved it in our 2005 study, and we repeated this in a very large group of people in last year, 2020. And we found that it really works. When people go on a plant-based diet without counting calories, without limiting the foods that they're eating, without limiting carbohydrate at all, but making a simple shift to plant foods and setting aside the oily foods, they lose weight. Their after-meal burn increases, and a lot of things happen in their body, like improvements in insulin sensitivity. I'm going to get to that in a minute. Geico is one of the biggest car insurance companies in the United States. They insure automobiles. And that building is about 3 blocks from where I'm speaking to you now. And so I was talking to the medical director at this insurance company, and she said to me, we have people here who are overweight. We have people here who have diabetes. Let's try a plant-based diet, not in your laboratory, but here at work. And I thought, that's a good idea. Let's see if this will work. And so we did 2 things. Everybody who wanted to lose weight or tackle their diabetes was invited to just a once-a-week lecture on how to do it. And we asked the cafeteria manager to have vegan meals there. Now, it took a little while for the cafeteria manager to understand what vegan actually meant. What's wrong with this menu item? Well, the manager finally figured it out that maybe you shouldn't have the bacon and cheese on your vegan burger. And what we found is that people lost weight very well. If they were in the control group, they didn't lose any weight. But if they were in the vegan group, they lost weight very nicely. And so our participants found that this was the most life-changing experience they could imagine. They lost a lot of weight. They increased their energy. They felt better than they had felt in years. So let's go further. This is the pancreas. The pancreas makes insulin. And I wonder if I can use a plant-based diet, not just to clean out my arteries, but also, and not just to lose weight, but also to improve diabetes. Well, in 2003, the National Institutes of Health gave our research team a grant to try to find a better diet for type 2 diabetes. And so we decided to compare a plant-based diet to a conventional diet. Conventional diet, limit calories, limit carbohydrate, avoid bad fat. Plant-based diet, no animal products. It's vegan. Minimize oils and favor low glycemic index foods. That just means instead of white bread, have pumpernickel bread or beans or something. It's not avoiding carbohydrate. It's choosing the carbohydrates with the slowest absorption of the glucose. To cut to the chase, we track hemoglobin A1C. And what we found is that A1C, which ought to be below 7, it was about 8 in all of our participants at the beginning. The control group, following the conventional diet, improved a bit. They dropped by about 0.4 absolute percentage points. But the vegan group dropped, what's that? About 1.2 or a little bit more, 1.2 absolute percentage points, 3 times better than the best current diet. Okay, so this was Vance. Vance was one of our first research participants. And when Vance began this diet, I was really quite struck by his experience. He told me he had diabetes all up and down his family tree, that he thought if he didn't get his diet under better control, he'd probably go blind, lose a leg. His father was dead at age 30. Vance was 31 when he was diagnosed with diabetes. He was in his late 30s when he came in to see us. He started the plant-based diet. He lost 60 pounds over the next year. He stopped his diabetes medications. His A1C dropped from 9.5 to 5.3. And 5.3 is not diabetes. It's not pre-diabetes. That's a normal A1C. And when this happened about 20 years ago, I had to close my office door because here was something that wasn't supposed to happen. I was taught in medical school that once you have diabetes, you'll always have diabetes. Here was a man who had had diabetes for years, but was now on no medications with an absolutely normal A1C, who could eat high carbohydrate foods and apples and oranges and bananas and spaghetti and bread, and nothing happened. Well, we started to realize that diabetes was a reversible condition. Instead of it being something you were stuck with, it was a two-way street. And if we take out the foods that are causing it, maybe we can heal it. Well, we're not the only one to have looked at this. Other research teams have looked at it. And as you can see on this forest plot, all the little black squares are to the left of the center line, meaning that A1C falls. Okay, so why? What our research team and others have found is that insulin resistance can change quite dramatically. Let me show you what I mean. This is a cell, this purple blob in the middle of your screen. Let's call it a muscle cell. Muscle cells have a fuel. It's called glucose, and glucose is their gasoline. When that goes into the cell, it gives them power. The problem is this: that glucose cannot get into that muscle cell. It's in the blood. It can't get into the cell. It can't get through that membrane. That membrane is not permeable to glucose until I have a key. That key is insulin, and the insulin key attaches to a receptor on the surface of that cell. And once the insulin key arrives, it opens up little channels that allow the glucose to come in. So the insulin key makes everything work. So where does diabetes come from? Diabetes comes from what I ate for dinner, or what I ate for lunch, or what I ate for breakfast. As a child growing up in North Dakota, these were foods we ate all the time. And we had lots of fat in our diet. Are these really fatty foods? Well, it's added up, yes. And the fat in the foods you eat ends up parking not just in your body fat, but in your muscle cells. Microscopic fat particles build up inside the muscle cells. Now, doctors hate to use a word like fat because it has only one syllable. So I'll call it intramyocellular lipid. Now, that actually just means inside the muscle cell is fat. And when the cell is filled with fat, it's a little bit like my front door. I get home, I take out my key and I put it in my front door lock, but it doesn't open. Why? Because the neighbor children did a prank. While I was gone, they put chewing gum in my lock. And my key no longer works. Now, there's nothing wrong with my key, but my lock is all filled with chewing gum, so I've got to clean it out. Well, your cells don't have chewing gum in them. What they have is fat. Chicken fat, beef fat, fish fat, olive oil, extra virgin olive oil, extra virgin olive oil, all kinds of grease is building up inside our cells. And when that happens, insulin doesn't work anymore. So the insulin key attaches and nothing happens. That cell is now insulin resistant. What do I do? Well, let's see. If I avoid animal products, there's no animal fat in my diet. If I avoid oils or added oils, there's not much of any kind of fat, and the fat disappears. And when that fat disappears, the insulin resistance is replaced by insulin sensitivity. And now my insulin key can work again. The channels open up, the glucose comes in the cell, and everybody is feeling good. Diabetes fueled by insulin resistance is a state, not a trait, and it can be reversed to a very substantial degree. Okay. Let me take you to Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut. Researchers at Yale brought in a group of young people, 26. They gave them a glucose tolerance test. You swallow 75 grams of syrup. And then some of the people turned out to be insulin sensitive. Others were insulin resistant. Well, who were they? They were young, late 20s. They were thin, 60 kilograms, 64 kilograms. They didn't have diabetes. These are healthy A1C values. But then everybody goes down to the basement. And there we have a scanner, a magnetic resonance scanner. And we're going to do MR spectroscopy studies where I'm going to look inside their muscle cells. And I'm going to see if I can find that intramyocellular lipid. On the left-hand side of this slide, you see all those dots? Every dot is a person. And that's the amount of intramyocellular lipid they had. And on the right-hand side there, those are the insulin-resistant participants. Okay, on the left, insulin sensitive. On the right, insulin resistant. We see the difference? Obviously, the insulin-resistant participants had a lot of fat inside their muscle cells. But that also causes other problems. Inside your cells, you've got mitochondria. As you remember from high school biology, their mitochondria are your burners that give you energy. And they were working pretty well in the insulin-sensitive participants. Again, every dot is a person. But in the insulin-resistant subjects, their mitochondria were not working very well. Okay, so what this means is that although our research team has shown that you can have a person who's up in years, who's had diabetes for a long period of time, if they change their diets, that fat can start to dissipate. Their insulin sensitivity can return. Their blood sugars can come down. Their need for medication can come down. In some cases, they get off them completely. But what the Yale researchers found is that this whole disease process starts way before that in young people. In fact, you can go into a high school here in Washington, D.C. or anywhere, and if you measure, you will find that fat has started to build up in the muscle and liver cells of children of 15 and 16 and 17. And they're starting to develop insulin resistance. They won't have diabetes now for another 15 years. The disease process started when they put their tray on the lunch line and started taking ham sandwiches and cheese pizza and fried junk that delivered a big load of fat that their cells were not prepared to accommodate. Now, you'll hear once in a while a doctor saying, well, wait a minute. A Mediterranean diet is just as good and it's a lot easier. Why don't you do Mediterranean instead? Well, is that sound advice? Well, a Mediterranean diet sounds appealing. Dr. Ansel Keys at the University of Minnesota was sitting at his desk one wintry day, wondering, what am I doing in Minneapolis? Wouldn't it be nice to be on the coast of Italy? And he fell in love with Southern Italian cuisine, especially a village called Nicotera. The diet was, at the time, the diet that economically disadvantaged people had. They had some bread and pasta and chickpeas and things, but not really a lot of meat and dairy products. And the Mediterranean diet was a term that he coined. It means a lot of plant foods, minimally processed. Your dessert will not be ice cream, it'll be fresh fruit. If you cook with fat, it won't be chicken fat or lard, it will be olive oil. But frankly, back in the 1950s and 60s, not so much of that. Eggs, occasionally, but not a lot. Red meat, not very much. Wine, sometimes. That's the Mediterranean diet. Sounds appealing. And everybody loves this idea because, frankly, we'd all like to sit on the coast of Italy, drinking a glass of red wine, watching the sunset. How does it work? Well, we brought in 62 participants here to our research center, and half of them went on the Mediterranean diet. The other half went on a vegan diet. And they followed this for 16 weeks, and then they switched. The Mediterranean group started the vegan diet. The vegan group started the Mediterranean diet. And what happened? Let me show you the weight changes. On the Mediterranean diet, the weight loss was very modest. On the vegan diet, it was quite robust. At 16 weeks, everyone was instructed to stop their diets, take 4 weeks off, and now begin the opposite diet. So the Mediterranean group went vegan, and their weight loss picked up. The vegan group now went Mediterranean, and their weight started to go in the opposite direction. And after 16 weeks, I have to tell you, the group that had begun initially the Mediterranean diet without much weight loss, then went vegan, they thought, thank you, I'm so glad that I could finally do the vegan diet. But the group that had been vegan at the beginning and then went Mediterranean was frankly furious. Because they had accommodated to a vegan diet, they liked it, they felt great, and then we made them go back to a Mediterranean diet. They didn't want fish, they didn't want grease, they didn't want to have eggs because these foods packed on the pounds again. We looked also at their cholesterol levels. Total cholesterol dropped 3 points, 3 milligrams per deciliter on the Mediterranean diet and almost 19 on the vegan diet. LDL dropped 0.5 point on the Mediterranean diet and 15 points on the vegan diet. Okay. Now, with regard to blood pressure, both groups improved their blood pressure. And for some reason that I don't know, there actually was a slight advantage of the Mediterranean diet for blood pressure. But our conclusion is that if a person wants to lose weight or improve their cholesterol, a Mediterranean diet is a placebo. It won't help with those things. And doctors should not recommend a Mediterranean diet for anyone who has those clinical goals. A vegan diet is far more effective. So we published this in the Journal of the American College of Nutrition last year. At the same time as we were looking at these, what I might call cardiometabolic issues, we started to discover that foods could do some other things that we really weren't expecting. And it related to hormones. This is a young woman named Robin, and Robin is the person who actually put me on this quest. And the reason was I was sitting right here at this desk and my phone rang, and Robin called me up. She said, Dr. Barnard, my mother asked me to call you. Her mother was a physician in another part of the country. And I said, well, yes, Robin, how can I help you? And she said, I can't get out of bed. About once every month, my menstrual pain, cramps, are so severe, I just can hardly move. And I have to go on a business trip and I'm miserable. What can I do? She wasn't asking about diabetes or weight problems or heart disease or any of these things. She had pain in her abdomen. As she was talking, I started to think, at Tufts University in Boston, researchers had brought in a group of women and they changed their diets. They increased the fiber content of their diet. That means beans and vegetables and fruits. And they reduced the fat in their diet, meaning getting away from the meat and cheese and fried things. And as they did this, they found that their estrogen levels dropped. I'm talking about estradiol and other estrogens. Their goal was to help the women to reduce their breast cancer risk. And as Robin was telling me her symptoms, I thought, well, I wonder if we reduce the amount of estrogen in your body, that means that your uterine lining, the endometrial layer, will not thicken up so much next month. And if it doesn't thicken up, then when it degenerates with menstrual flow, it won't produce so much prostaglandins. Maybe you won't hurt so much. Anyway, this was what was going through my mind when she was describing this. So I said, here's what I suggested. Probably something that no doctor had ever suggested before, which was, let me give you some painkillers for the next 48 hours so you can function. But for the next 4 weeks, would you like to try an experiment? And she said, I'll try anything. And I said, vegan diet, no added oils, okay? What that means is I'm going to maximize your fiber and I'm going to minimize your grease, and let's see what happens. Okay. She called back a month later and said, Dr. Barnard, I have to tell you something. My period started today and I have 0 symptoms, no pain, nothing. The next month, same story, and the month after that. And until she did great, until she started compromising on the diet with more greasy kinds of foods, then the pain came back. Okay, so this was an N of 1 based just on an educated guess on my part. So I decided to see, could this kind of prescription actually affect hormones for a large group of people? So we began a new study with our friends at Georgetown University's Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology. We brought in a group of women. They all had moderate to severe pain. Half of them went on Robin's diet. The other half got a supplement, which was in fact a placebo. After 2 months, 2 menstrual cycles, they switched. The diet group went to the supplement group went to the diet. And in a nutshell, it worked. We published the findings in the journal Obstetrics and Gynecology, and what we showed was that pain intensity fell, pain duration fell, and premenstrual symptoms like bloating and water retention improved as well. Okay, wow. So what this means is that I've now got power over how my hormones work. But wait a minute, I knew that already because insulin is a hormone and I can get insulin working again. Maybe I can get hormones to behave. Okay, let's go now to the other end of the reproductive window, menopause. When a woman is 50 or 52 or 53, she's sitting in a board of directors meeting and suddenly the blood vessels in her skin vasodilate. They become wider. And when they do, they release heat into the skin. This is a hot flash. It's as if somebody just opened up the radiator and now it's 150 degrees in her body. She breaks into a sweat. And this happens every day, several times a day. And it happens at night, 3 or 4 times a night. She's drenched with sweat. She never gets a good night's sleep. She feels terrible. She goes to her doctor who says, I can give you estrogens, but I do have to inform you that these will increase your risk of breast cancer. If you stay on them for the next 10 years, you have a 1 in 25 risk of getting breast cancer that I caused. They increase the risk of heart problems, dementia, blood clots, and other issues. At which point, this woman says, I don't think I want that. Is there any other way? Before we say no, let's go to Japan. In the 1980s, researchers interviewed more than 1,000 women in Japan. They found that hot flashes were uncommon. 15% of women had them. But then as the diet westernized, as years went by, it changed from a rice-based diet to a meatier diet. Hot flashes went to about 40% or more. Okay, what's going on here? Two hypotheses. One, the Japanese diet is a rice-based diet, at least traditionally. Lots of plants, lots of vegetables and grains and bean products like tofu and miso. And in fact, soybeans are sort of special because they have isoflavones like genistein and daidzein that are like medicine in their own way. You already know that soy products reduce the risk of breast cancer. You already know that soy products improve survival in women previously diagnosed with breast cancer. So soy is good in those ways. But researchers started to think maybe soybeans are part of the reason why they didn't have so much in the way of hot flashes before. Hold that thought. It's not just in Japan. In Mexico, in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, researchers interviewed Mayan women and found that they didn't have hot flashes either. In fact, they said, look, they didn't have hot flashes. They didn't have any other symptoms of menopause. They felt fine through this transition. What do they eat? Rice? I don't think so. Their grain is corn. Soybeans? Tofu? I don't think so. Their beans are black beans. And they eat other vegetables. This is one called la chaya, which grows throughout the Yucatan Peninsula. So they have a plant-based diet in a little bit different way. So our research team decided to do a test. We brought in a group of women suffering with hot flashes, moderate to severe. And we asked half of them to do a diet and the other half to not make any changes at all for the duration of the study, which was 12 weeks. What's the diet? The diet was no animal products. Keeping oils low sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? This is the diet for losing weight or tackling diabetes or cleaning out your heart. But we added soybeans, a half a cup of soybeans every day. And we simply asked them to put them in their pressure cooker, mature soybeans, cook them for 40 minutes, apportion them out into half cup servings, and have that every day. That was the whole intervention. What did we find? Well, in the control group, people improved a little bit, but in the diet group, the moderate to severe hot flashes dropped by 84%. That's huge. And the average woman lost 8 pounds in the course of this study. And not only did their vasomotor symptoms improve, that's hot flashes, but their psychosocial symptoms like mood improved, physical symptoms like aches and pains, and sexual symptoms all improved as well. Now, let me hasten to say that if a person is following a vegan diet already and they're minimizing oils, but they still have hot flashes, they may wonder, could this affect them? Could this help them? And the answer is yes. You've got 2 of the 3 parts down. Add the soybeans and see if you don't improve and can say goodbye to your hot flashes. For many people, we've seen them go away in a matter of days. For other people who have been on particularly bad diets before, it might take a few weeks, but put it to work. Okay, so what's a healthy diet? A healthy diet is fruits and grains and legumes. That means beans and lentils and peas and vegetables. You do need vitamin B12, not optional. You need it for healthy blood and healthy nerves. The amount you need is very, very small, but you do need to have it. In Dr. Campbell's question and answer period, the issue came up about COVID and diet. And as was hinted at in the response, diet makes a difference, according to the best data we have in COVID. Now, we frankly knew that at the beginning because when COVID first arrived, it was much better tolerated in people who did not have overweight, who did not have diabetes, who did not have hypertension. So if you're on a healthy diet and all those things are not your issue, you are more likely to survive if COVID came in. But then the question was, do plant-based diets per se really help? So there was a study of healthcare workers in 6 different countries, and those who were on plant-based diets had 73% reduction in the likelihood of severe COVID, and those on low carbohydrate diets, fad diets for weight loss, had a 48% increased risk of severe COVID. Is there any other data to confirm this? Sure. The COVID symptom study, you know this study, huge classic study, more than half a million participants in the UK and the US. When COVID arrived, this cohort was organized to track their symptoms on their cell phones and report how they were doing day by day. These people developed COVID in 30-some% of the case of the participants. And then the question was, what are you eating? And they published the results a couple of months ago. If you had a more plant-based diet, not necessarily vegan, but more toward vegan, you had a 9% reduction in risk of any COVID positivity. But let's say you were more plant-based and you looked at severe COVID-19. In that case, the risk of severe COVID-19 was cut by about 40%. Okay, so the evidence is strong that it's going to help. But wait, let's go further. July 4th. The 4th of July is the American Independence Day. For some reason, we celebrate independence from England. I'm not entirely sure that was the world's best thing, but that's what we did. And so on the 4th of July in Provincetown, Massachusetts, it's a tourist town. Everybody got together. They were not socially distanced. And there were a number of vaccinated people who got sick. Well, what's going on? Oh, I'm sorry. Let me just skip through this. What researchers then wanted to see is, why would vaccinated people in Provincetown get sick? They were vaccinated against COVID-19. What could be the problem? The question is, why do vaccines fail sometimes? And researchers gave us an interesting answer. They looked at 86 healthcare workers, all of whom had had the Pfizer vaccine, 2 doses. They measured their waistline, they measured their blood pressure and cholesterol, and they asked them if they smoked. Here's what they found. On the x-axis here is your waist circumference. The further out to the right, the heavier you are. The y-axis is whether you could make antibodies after having had the vaccine. If you make the antibodies, presumably you're better protected. What did the data show? The heavier you are, the worse your antibody production. Okay, all right, let's go further. The non-smokers are the black box here. The smokers are the black box, the non-smokers are the white box. Smokers produce less antibodies. People with high blood pressure are the black box in the middle of the screen. They do worse. People who have dyslipidemia, that means high cholesterol, they do worse too. Okay, so we're starting to make sense of this. All of these things, having excess body weight, having diabetes, having high cholesterol, having high blood pressure, that makes COVID a killer. It also makes vaccines not work very well. And what is obviously the driver behind body weight, cholesterol, blood pressure, one of the biggest drivers, of course, is the foods that we choose. So at this point, to suggest that diet doesn't matter with COVID is not something that you want to put any money on, because we want to have not just all the public health steps that we can take to contain the virus, we also want to eat a healthy breakfast and lunch and dinner. Okay. So far, I've talked about science. But one of the nicest things about science, particularly nutrition science, is that we can apply it. And we found some fun ways to apply it. And if you don't mind, I'd like to finish by just sharing this with you. It's a concept called universal meals. Everyone has a seat at the table. Here's what I mean. You can travel nowadays. You can get on a plane. You can go to a restaurant, just about anywhere in the world. And what you discover is that things are changing. We're more diverse than ever before. People from all walks of life are now getting together. And with that diversity comes a diversity of diet needs. Some people want a gluten-free diet. Some people might have allergies. Somebody else might have a religious mandate, so I'm not going to eat pork or beef or whatever it is. And then there are some people who are vegan. The question is, can we all sit at the same table? Universal meals is a way to do that. What am I talking about? I'm talking about skipping problem ingredients. Okay, here we are. We're at a conference, and here's somebody who has a Hindu tradition that they still observe. Okay, do you want beef? I don't think so. Let's get rid of beef. Here's somebody else from a Muslim tradition. How about pork? I don't think so. We're going to get rid of that. Here's somebody from an observant Jewish tradition, and they're glad to be rid of the pork, and they don't eat shellfish either. Someone else has an allergy to peanuts. Let's get rid of that. Somebody else might have a gluten sensitivity. Let's get rid of gluten. And then there's somebody else who says, I have got a heart for animals. I don't think I'm going to eat animal-derived products. So the dairy is gone. Eggs are gone. Fish, honey too. What does that leave? Vegetables, fruits, legumes, and non-gluten grains. Does that sound like dinner? Well, we went to our CIA. No, the other CIA, the Culinary Institute of America. And these are the leaders in recipe development in the United States. And we asked them, make us some meals that don't have beef and pork and shellfish and dairy and all these other things. And let's see if it looks like dinner. We also went to Hollywood, California, and we worked with Spork Foods, and they developed more meals for us, and others were devised. And what we discovered is that you can make golden waffles and sweet potato hash and lentil soup that don't have any of the ingredients that would bother anybody. In fact, everybody can eat these things. And we had many, many other choices of soups, salads, main dishes. These are arancini. It's a traditional Italian food. And here it is prepared for my fancy restaurant. And here is the same meal prepared for an airline or a train. These foods work everywhere. Here's a veggie burger on the airline. Here's the same one at my restaurant. Okay, so what we've discovered is that universal meals allow restaurateurs to feed everybody and allow a person who says, wait a minute, I'm on this airplane and I forgot to order a vegan meal. Do you have anything for me? And the answer is, of course, everyone has a seat at this table. Now, is this healthy? Well, I devised a menu for Wednesday with golden waffles and creamy kale with chickpeas and red lentil soup and a quinoa bowl and apples and blueberries, and a menu for Thursday and a menu for Friday. And now I'm going to see, are they healthy? And the way we measure this is with something called the Alternate Healthy Eating Index. It's Harvard University's way of assessing the healthfulness of your diet. Now, the average American has a healthfulness of their diet of 45 on the AHEI. Your Wednesday menu adds up to 82, and Thursday and Friday add up to 77 each. In other words, these are not just foods that everybody can enjoy, they're healthy foods. They're terrific. So this is a way that we can eat at work, at home, and we have all kinds of information for them. Why am I telling you this? Because you might be affiliated with a university or a business or maybe a restaurant. And if you go to pcrm.org/universal meals, it's all there for you. It's free. We've got the recipes, we've got food photography, we've got all kinds of things to get you excited. So I'm asking you to pick up your megaphone and scream to everybody that yes, a plant-based diet is great for your health, but it tastes good too. And you know what? It might even be a way for us to unite people together. We have some other things. Our nutrition guide for clinicians is a free download, everything from Alzheimer's disease to varicose veins. It's all online, it's all free, please use it. And if you would like to come visit us here in Washington, D.C. in August, please do. Our International Conference on Nutrition and Medicine will be in full swing for 3 full days. We've got a huge group of wonderful speakers, and we'd love to see you. Let me stop at that point, and I just want to say congratulations again on everything you've done. I know that the work that you've been doing, the conversations that you have sparked, have changed so many people's lives. You'll never have any idea how many lives you have saved, but I guarantee you it's an enormous number. So thank you for letting me be part of this.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barnard. Please, you might turn off your mics and give an applause so you can hear it a bit distant. Thank you so much for this enlightening and excellent and inspiring presentation, Dr. Barnard. Now I do have to turn off a few mics again. Yeah. So let's go on with already a lot of comments in the and compliments, people saying thank you so much. A lot of comments on that, and then we have quite a few questions as well. So let me get started with a few of them and see if we can cover how many we can cover. So a general question that someone asked is, are all fats bad? And there was a related question saying how more specifically about, for example, oils from nuts in particular.
Yes. If I'm cooking with chicken fat, fats are all mixtures. There's chicken fat has some saturated fat, some unsaturated fat. And if I put some of it into a soup or a meal or I cook with it, I want to know maybe how much of it is saturated fat, because that's the part that raises my cholesterol level. And that's the part that's associated with Alzheimer's disease. And the answer is 30%. Chicken fat is 30% saturated fat. I'm going to throw it away. I'm going to use olive oil instead. I've dropped that 30 down to 14. That's a good thing to do. But if I have a non-stick pan, I'm down to 0. Okay, good. So for my heart, avoiding oils is a good idea. For diabetes, it's a good idea too, because remember the cell, that's all the fat building up inside. Animal fat might be the worst. Vegetable oils contribute too. For hormonal issues, for reasons I cannot fully explain, estrogens are influenced by the oil content of the diet, as well as the fiber content of the diet. So there we want to minimize them too. But if you're young, healthy, skinny, and you don't have any of these issues, and you're at a fancy restaurant for your anniversary, and somebody gives you pasta with a little drop of olive oil on the side, you don't necessarily need to sweep that away with your napkin.
And again, particularly on nuts, again.
Nuts are the same story. Their saturated fat percentage is much less, but they have all the other issues. They're still 9 calories per gram. They're still fattening. And keep in mind, nature packed nuts individually. Each one is in its own little case that you have to break open. And it's only when people invented factories that they could break them all open for you and put them in a jar and call it peanut butter, that we could really start overdosing on nuts. So the occasional nut is not a problem. When it becomes a problem is if it's a whole food group of its own.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Barnard. Then we have Astrid, who is saying, thank you for your great work. I'm a physician in general practice and very inspired by your studies. Astrid is asking here, are there any studies on like a normal, you can say, a vegan diet on type 2 diabetes, or more particularly, she's asking, glycemic control could be easier with more fat in the diet, she's suggesting. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm not fully sure I understand. Are we saying that it would be easier to adopt if a person were having more fat?
No, it's more the whole question of glycemic control. Like I assume it's related to this thing, you know, when you have with more carbohydrates or of a different sort, like if there are less carbohydrates and more fat, I guess the assumption here should be that like a glycemic control could be easier if there's a little more fat and a little less carbohydrates. Or
fat interferes with glycemic control. So when the fat goes into the cell, insulin no longer works very well. So if a person's having a lot of problems with their blood sugar, particularly in the context of type 2 diabetes, the best thing you can do is to avoid the added fats. Most people with type 2 diabetes also have extra weight. And when they do this combination of avoiding the animal products and keeping oils low, they conquer both problems at the same time. Now, but implicit in your question is the fact that your patients have read books telling them that they develop diabetes as a result of eating bread. And so they have become terrified of bread, rice, potatoes, carbohydrates. And in a way you can understand it, because if you're very insulin resistant and your cells are filled with fat, then anything you eat that has carbohydrate makes your blood sugar rise because your cells can't take it in anymore. And so people go for the rest of their lives catering to their insulin resistance. Instead, let's conquer the insulin resistance. That means getting the fat out of the diet.
Thank you. Then we have 2 questions on children, and the very smallest one, the infants. So the first of them is related to, it's from Katrina here earlier. What are your thoughts on omega-3 from plants in relation to pre- and postnatal brain development? For example, algae, supplements from algae, is that a good idea? Or yeah, any?
They're fine. You can get them, but I have to say, the science is still evolving here. We don't really know if they are beneficial or not. You do need omega-3. And there's only one omega-3 that's considered an essential fatty acid, and that's alpha-linolenic acid. As you know, that's the 18-carbon chain. And your body has enzymes that will extend it to longer chains. And those enzymes are interfered with by other fats. So if we're eating a lot of other grease, that slows those enzymes down. So our best rule of thumb is to have a lot of omega-3 in the form of alpha-linolenic acid from plants and avoid other fatty foods. Now, we hear about flax oil or chia or other things that are good sources of omega-3, but we forget that green vegetables, they don't have a lot of fat, but what they have is proportionally very high in omega-3. So I suggest we bring in the green vegetables in a big way. Is there value in supplementing omega-3s like EPA and DHA? The jury is still out on that. They don't seem to help with regard to heart disease. They do seem to increase the risk of prostate cancer in men. We have seen some evidence that people who are very low in omega-3 in their blood are at higher risk for Alzheimer's disease, which suggests value of supplementing. But does supplementing actually change that? We don't really know. So anyway, that's kind of where we are, and we're going to have to look to more evidence to see where things go.
Thank you so much for your excellent responses here. So we have a question from Miguel, who is asking, how about the foods with a low calorie content for children? Like the whole thing about getting enough calories and fat or slash calories, within the limited, calories you can take as a very small child. That's and you have to the child has to grow as well. So what do you think about the risks that if the child grows enough, if you go very low on fats for small children or infants? Or do you have different recommendations for them? Yeah.
Well, the recommendations are the same. Let's start at birth though. Breastfeeding is not optional. Breastfeeding is part of reproduction. Unless there is some reason why it's just physically impossible. Breastfeeding is really important. And mom should be supplementing vitamin B12 herself. And then after breastfeeding, which hopefully will go on for a good long time, after breastfeeding, then the child needs the same food groups that the adults need. And those are fruits and vegetables and whole grains and legumes, and the child will need vitamin B12. And that's really about it. If you want to have foods that seem normal to the child, like the child goes to school and the other kids are eating bologna sandwiches or other kinds of meats, and you get veggie meats that look like animal-derived ones but are really from soy or whatever, those are fine. They're perfectly okay. You don't necessarily need them, but they're not harmful. Do you want? And some people would make a case that you can be a little more tolerant of fat in the diet in young kids, and that may be true. It's probably okay, but don't feel a need to go crazy with it. Kids do perfectly well with vegetables and fruits and whole grains and beans. And one last thing, don't arm wrestle with your children about making them eat their broccoli if they don't want it. Children are dietary conservatives. They want foods that are really simple and familiar, and they're afraid of asparagus. And as time goes on, they will discover that it means them no harm, and they will start to eat those foods with a more adventurous spirit.
Thank you. And are there any, the last question maybe on babies here is a question from Kari. So are there any kind of fats that are particularly important, do you think, for babies and young children?
Yeah, well, there are only two essential fats that kids need, alpha-linolenic acid and linoleic acid. There's never a shortage of linoleic acid. For ALA, alpha-linolenic acid, it's in vegetables in particular, some in beans, some in fruits, and a lot in nuts, seeds, and things like that.
Thank you so much. Then we do have a question from Mai, who is actually, by mistake, I started making the question earlier to Professor Campbell, but it was actually to you, Dr. Barnard. So it's a personal thank you from Mai, who is actually, she's saying that you have been facilitating her plant-based transition when she was posted in the DC, including through the Excellent Food for Life classes and the Kickstart Intensive course. So her question is regarding bone health. So could you delve a bit deeper into what could be done to manage or ameliorate the seemingly greater risk for vegans in terms of osteoporosis, as there's been some studies in the recent years, beyond the advice of greens, beans, and vitamin D?
Well, it's not really rocket science. There's not a lot that need be said, but it should be said that for people on plant-based diets and people who are not yet on plant-based diets, people really don't eat diets that are very good for their bones. It's true really pretty much across the board. And so what are the elements of it? The first thing, obviously, is you do need calcium, and people talk about this a lot, and you gave the issue. The green leafy vegetables should be front and center, but they're not the only thing. Long before people could purify water, mineral water has a surprising calcium content. And if you don't believe that, go to the store and pick up a bottle of mineral water and imagine how many bottles of mineral water would you normally consume in the course of the day. And you'll see it's a surprising amount of calcium before you even took your first bite of solid food. So modern life has taken us away from high calcium foods, but we should really put them back. You need to absorb vitamin D, and that means you need to absorb calcium using vitamin D, and that means you need sunlight. Sunlight is sometimes a more challenging thing for many of us. And if you don't get sunlight on a regular basis without sunscreen, then you need to take it as a supplement. I would recommend 2,000 IUs a day. Third, you need to exercise so that your bones have a reason to live. And avoid things like smoking and other things that interfere with bone health. That's really kind of it. So a good, healthy diet is an important thing. But none of this is a reason to go back to dairy. Cows don't make calcium. Cows just eat calcium. And then they stick some of it in their milk, and only about 30% of that is even absorbed by your body. So forget that. And omnivores don't have particularly good bones. If you go into the hospital and look at people who are there for a serious hip fracture, you're not going to count lots of vegans there. These are people who have not had very well-planned diets along exactly the same parameters I just described.
Thank you so much. We're getting close to the end. Are you with us for a few more minutes? And I'll take one or two questions, and then I'll be done for today. So we have a question from Katrina here, who's also a doctor, and she's asking about kidney disease. Like, is it possible to keep blood albumin levels up and potassium down as a vegan? And she's explaining that renal dietitians here in Denmark recommend minimizing fresh fruit, veg, and whole grains, and eating all the meat, white rice, and pasta you want to keep potassium down and albumin up, which seems counterintuitive and unhealthy, as she writes. So what to do, she's saying.
Yeah, okay. It's a great question. First of all, when we look at the contributors to renal failure, or what I really mean is your kidneys are teetering on the edge of expiring. You've got a little bit of kidney function, but much of it has been killed off by hypertension or diabetes or a raging infection. The best way to kill off your remaining kidney function is with a really high protein meaty diet. You don't want to do that. You want to protect your kidneys. And so a plant-based diet is an urgent thing for anybody with compromised renal function. However, your kidneys are your filters. And so things are getting really complicated for you now, because instead of being able to filter things and manage your electrolytes as you could before, it's more difficult for you. So the short answer is yes, absolutely, people can be on a plant-based diet, and they should be. But they should also be under the care of a competent registered dietitian who works with them to be able to watch their numbers and make sure that they're not running into trouble. But yes, absolutely. And there are a number of very good dietitians who have written about this extensively, and it really is the treatment of choice. So thank you for raising that important question.
Thank you. And then maybe a final one here. Sanya is asking, saying she has two girls, 12 and 14, who have been vegan for 4 years. And Sanya is very aware of them getting enough nutrients to grow and function optimally. She says they're both very lean and in the low end of height and slow puberty. So she's very insistent about healthy fats, such as nuts. But what should she do? Is there any other food that she could or should worry about?
Well, first of all, they're lucky to have you as a parent. That's great. They've made a wonderful choice at 12 and 14. At that point, most children still have a heart for animals. And let's say anything that allows compassion to persist in the human psyche, that's a darn good thing. They have a thought about the world that they live in. Anything that allows that to persist is a really good thing too. And finally, about their body. Parents are always in competition, not necessarily with the other families, but sometimes with the norms that they are told when they visit the pediatrician. Oh, your daughter is 14 and she's not menstruating yet. That's a big problem. Let's get this reproductive window wide open. Stop. Let's go back. The human animal has a reproductive window, which has been changing over time. And if you look back in the mid-1800s, menarche, first period, occurred much later, not at 12, not at 14, but even in the later teens. That was normal. It's been slow. And by the way, that makes sense because at 12, a girl can be physically capable of having a child, but not psychologically capable of caring for that child. What I'm suggesting is that's not a normal kind of maturation, despite the fact that that's what we're seeing throughout Europe and in the United States. It would be more sensible if we were able to have children at around 18 or 19. Now, I would argue that a person is actually qualified to be a parent when they're about 45. But biology has a little bit different idea that, well, maybe 18, 19, that's the idea. The whole idea that children should be reproductively fertile at 12 or 13 or 14 is something Mother Nature cannot figure out how that happened. And at the other end of our reproductive years, when you're 50 and Mother Nature says, hey, this is not a time for you to have a toddler on your kitchen floor, factory's closed, the ovaries are not going to release eggs anymore because you've got enough children, take care of them. And we take medications, all kinds of things to try to say, no, I don't want menopause to happen. Wait. Nature had some ideas for us that were really well-meaning. Okay, so if your children are not menstruating at this point, first of all, they do need to have adequate food, and that means 4 things: fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and beans. They should have those. They should have vitamin B12, not optional. If they want to have a little more fat, fine. If they want to have veggie burgers and those kinds of things, fine. You know, if it's less processed, it's okay, but not everything has to be raw, organic, and they don't have to drink just distilled water. They can have a normal life with hopefully the better choices in there, but they're going to be A-okay. If they're on the slim side of normal, that's all right. A healthy body mass index is between 18.5 and about 25. Go into a BMI calculator online. If they're in that window, it's fine. The only thing I would encourage you is you do have to be insistent that everybody else in the family use those kids as their role models. Eat like they do. And don't give them a hard time. They're doing a good thing.
Wow, this was the best way we could possibly end this presentation, I think. Actually, I have to compliment you a lot on that. This is actually something we're really fighting for, to get to the authorities in Denmark, saying when young people make an ethical decision, whether it's for the animals or for the world, for climate and sustainability, we should support them and help them, inform them, not make problems out of it. And it's really sad when you kind of make it a problem when a young person has making a decision. So thank you for that very beautiful statement. Let's give a big applause to Dr. Neal Barnard. Please give a hand here, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Oh, yeah, sorry. And I just want to say again, thank you so much for joining us here. And I'm sorry, there were a few more questions out there. Some of them you might find online either at the PCRM or maybe at our website as well, where we have some nutritional information. There was also a question about male sexuality. For that, you might have a look at the Game Changers movie and some of the references in that one. And I think real studies, more scientific studies, might be replicated soon from the Game Changers most famous scene. So you might have a look there for the person who asked about that. And regarding supplements, please do have a look at PCRM or at our website. But again, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Barnard, for our anniversary. This was very enlightening and inspiring, and we're so happy to have you here. And yeah, I hope all of you enjoyed it. We're also seeing a lot of very grateful comments here in the comments field from all of you. So thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Barnard, and keep doing your excellent work for the sake of the whole world. Thank you
very much, and you as well. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And yeah, with that said, just want to say to every one of you, we want you a very beautiful Thursday, well, afternoon in the US, but evening, night here in Denmark. And I can just switch to Danish now, maybe. Jeg vil bare sige tusind tak, fordi I var med os her til aften, og med til at, nu har vi jo fejret jubilæum på flere måder. For nogle uger siden havde vi noget for politikere og erhvervsliv, så havde vi noget på Københavns Rådhus i går, og så har vi så en online version her, som i denne omgang bliver den tredje fejring. Men vi ser lidt på, når coronasituationen bløder lidt op, forhåbentlig åbner lidt op i løbet af 2022, så kan det være, at vi kan få en anden form for lidt større fejring. Blandt andet så bliver der en stor messe, formentlig i Høgsenhallen næste efterår igen, inden vi kommer for langt ind på vinteren, for man ved jo aldrig. Men have en rigtig dejlig aften og en skøn december måned, og god jul alle sammen. Og ja, hvis ikke I allerede er medlemmer af DVF i forvejen, så kunne det være, at nogle af jer har lyst til at blive medlemmer. Jo flere vi er, jo stærkere en forening er vi. Ha' en skøn aften alle sammen, og tak fordi I var med.
Mange tak.